Right, let's get started on time. So welcome to the final regular session of the day, session 4 on long-term trajectories of change. Although, of course, you're not going to leave after this because we have our invited session after that at 5:15. So what is this session about? Well, we have a diverse set of papers, but they're all addressing the issue of long-term and sustained change in learning. The first two papers, roughly speaking, are asking the question, did it happen? And we'll have a specific paper, that's a paper that Léonie is going to talk about from Nigeria, looking at the impact of the free primary education programme and trying to get into whether there was change and what the mechanism was there. And we'll have a more global paper presented by Justin, who's going to ask the question, is the learning crisis new? What happened to education quality over the latter half of the 20th century? So really long term. And he's doing this by some fantastic data, careful data work, linking cross-sectional surveys. Then the second two papers are going to ask a slightly different but related question, what's needed to make it happen, to make long-term change happen? And Ben is going to talk about, well, he's going to give us an account of the collective wisdom on this issue from his interviews with senior education sector leaders. And Michelle is going to talk about a series of case studies informed by a conceptual framework. So did it happen? And then how do we make it happen is roughly speaking the tenor of the session. So I'm going to hand straight over online to Léonie to tell us about the first of those from Nigeria.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Are you able to see my screen? Could you hear me?
Please, could you share your slides on the screen? We're not seeing them. Thank you.
Could you hear me, please?
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Léonie Bonou. I'm from the African School of Economics in Benin, and I'm presenting this work as part of Rise Nigeria CRT. So the long-term effects of the free primary education program in Nigeria and in neighboring Beninese community. I will present these works through that agenda, motivation, method, result, discussion, and conclusion and implication. So as a motivation, it has been known globally that the free education is a key input to boost the quality of education, increase student enrollment, and keep children at school. But there are also some studies that show that there are some time-free education programs that fail to achieve their goal. For instance, in Nigeria, the federal government and several regional government also set some free primary education that fail to achieve their set goal. For instance, we have the FP program, free education program that was in the SM region that is not sustained. And there were also the universal primary education program at the national level that did not get much importance than the one in the Western region. So the one that was implemented in the Western region from 1955 to 1966 has been seen as a benchmark of education expansion in Nigeria and the most unprecedented education reform in Africa south of Sahara. When we look at the numbers, we can see in that table from 1953 to 1966, the number of girls and boys that were enrolled in school. And particularly for the year where FP was implemented, we can see a big increase of 77% in the enrollments. And mostly this was for girls. It was the same at the financial level. We can see in the last column of this table that the share of education that was within the regional budget was high, and this remains slightly high till the end of the program in 1965. And within that share, which is about 40%, 80% was devoted to a primary education only. So in the literature, we can see that there is even this in the increase in enrollments of the people from 5 to 40-year-olds in the year that followed the FPE program in the Western region. But we lack of evidence on the long-run life outcome of these students. And we are asking also ourselves if there is an impact in the next generation. And we lack also evidence on the spillover effects within.
Hi, Léonie, it's Fred here. Just we're not seeing your slides at the moment. We can share them this end. If you could just tell us which slide you're on, we can move them forward for you.
Okay.
Or I'll let you share. Let's try that again. So if I stop sharing, if you'd like to try sharing again, that'd be great. Thanks.
So I can stop sharing
Well, if you could start sharing, that'd be great. Thanks.
Let me stop sharing and pick it again to see.
If you prefer, we can share our screen and you can tell us just to move forward. Should we do that?
Will you see now?
Yeah, that's perfect. We're getting that. Yeah, brilliant. If you go full screen on that, perfect. Well done. Thank you.
So can I continue with the motivations?
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you.
So I was saying that the share in the budget was a bit high, and this remained the same till the end of the FPE program in the Western regions. So I was saying also that in the literature, we have most evidence that there is an increase in enrollment rates for pupils from 5 to 14-year-olds in the year that followed the FPE program. But we lack evidence on the long-run life outcome of those students. We lack also evidence on the intergenerational impacts of the program and also in the spillover effects in directly impacted regions in Nigeria and also cross the national border in Benin. So in this study, we are examining the effect of the free primary education program that was implemented in the Western region of Nigeria from 1955 to 1966. And that program has the goal to improve only the access to education, but also the quality of education, because at that time, the education was the purpose of the missionary school and people did not believe a lot. It was also a kind of system of 3I, reading, arithmetic, and also religious studies. So the government that came into power at that time has seen this like the other religious group was excluded, and then it set this program and it was education as its first priority of that government. So we are seeking to know if this program was successful, if the program has persisted over time, and also how did the program influence the demand of education in Nigeria and the neighboring community in Benin that share cultural and historical relationship with Nigeria. We are measuring the outcome, schooling outcome, such as the attendance and the primary completion. In terms of life outcome, we have worked on fertility. We work also on occupational choices and political participation. But in this presentation, I will just present the preliminary result on political participation. And also we work on the next generation. So the method, I will show the identification, I will show the theory of change, identification strategy, and the econometric specification. So as I said earlier, there was a challenge in Nigeria that at the time of FPE, it was to respond to the modern economic requirements, not only increase education enrollment, but also the quality, as in the population, the education was perceived as the Christian purpose, and population didn't see itself involved in that kind of purposes. So this necessitated for the government that came into power to depart radically from the existing educational structure and make the education free, not only to make education free, but to make instruction in local language. And then there were a massive teacher recruitment and also a lot of school facility building. And from this reform, what was expected as short-term outcome is that the introduction in local instruction in local language facilitate the community engagement and participation in schooling. That will increase the pupil enrollment and also make people stay in school. As long-term outcome, it has to improve the labor market outcome, children's school outcome, demographic characteristics such as fertility, the living standard, and also political participation in social network. And then the supporting factors that we have at school level, as I already said, we have school infrastructure building, and there were a massive recruitment of teachers. But also at community level, the fact that the reform was made in local language, we need to send our kids to school in local language. This facilitates the community integration and community belief to that purpose of education. And also the last thing is that it was a commitment of the government that set this as the first priority of its government. So how do we do to identify our subjects? We identify 5 locations. The first location is the direct literacy location in the Western region of Nigeria, where the FP program was implemented. And then we have 2 spillover locations, one in Nigeria that is near the Western region, and in the other side in Benin, the community that border the Western region and speak the same language as the Western region communities. And also we have 2 other control zone in Nigeria that are far from the Western region, and also in the other side in Benin, the community that are far from the border and do not have proximity and closeness with the Western region in Nigeria. And we also use the variation across birth cohort to identify our subjects. Those who were born before 1940 were at 15-year-old at the time of FP and were not able to attend school. They were much old to attend school at that time. So those people constitute our pre-FP cohort. And then we have the FP cohort involving people who born from 1941 to 1960, and also those who are post-FP cohorts who born after 1961. In all the locations that I described earlier, we use school record to identify the subject, to make the list of subjects who attended school during the time of the study. So in some locations, we were not able to get all record, and we wanted also to survey people who were of school age at that time, but did not go to school. And we used focus group discussion to get them. And the focus group discussion involved people who were at school age at that time and were the influential people in each big family in the community. So about 76% of our subjects are alive, and where they are not still alive, we use key informant to inform about them, their life, and also the life of their descendants. Overall, we survey in 6 states in Nigeria and 7 Yoruba-speaking Beninese municipalities that share the border with Nigeria. And we have 3,340 subjects in our sample. So here I'm showing you the map of the survey location. You can see the map of Nigeria here, and near that one, you have the map of Benin. So the part that is highlighted in Chadon here, is the Western region where the FP program was implemented. And we got survey in that zone, and also in nearing location here and far from that location. And on Benin side, you can see the community that are bordering that region here. We choose them as spillover zone in Benin, and we choose also some other communities that are far from the border as control zone in Benin. We model each outcome variable.
Léonie, you have a little bit less than 5 minutes left.
Okay, in function of the treatment variable, the quad variable, and the crossing of the 2. So gamma here is our main estimate that we are looking for. And we model also in function of the descent to the Western region, and also the set of control variables that involve the age, sex, and also an indicator of the subjects being alive or not. So I will present here some preliminary results on school achievement, attendance in primary completion, on life achievement that I also mentioned, political participation, and the result of next generation. So in terms of school attendance, the line which is in blue here is for the Western zone where the FP program was implemented. So we can see that the FP program has increased the probability of people to attend, of people who belong to the Western region and from the FP cohort to attend the school comparatively to the control zone, those who are far from the Western zone. So you can see the line for the control zone here, which is in yellow. And then for the spillover zone, there is not, we don't find a positive, a significant impact on the FP cohort, but we can see after the FP cohort, we can see on a positive impact on the school attendance, which is in the red line here. Regarding the school completion, we have the graph on the left-hand side for all sexes combined and this for female. So the results are more conclusive for the female who were likely to attend and to complete primary school in the location where the FP was implemented in the Western region comparatively to a zone which were control zone. And then I will move to a left achievement in terms of political participation. So we ask subjects if they participate to political meeting, even though they're not involved in a political party, and also if they're used to vote. So we can see in the line that I color in red here, that for female particularly, we can say that the FE program is associated with increase in political participation for female in the Western region. And regarding the effect on the cohorts, there is also positive impacts for FP cohort and also after the FP cohort. The result on next generation, we have asked people about the number of children that they have and the number of children that they enroll to school. And we compute the percentage of children who attend the school. So the results show that for FP cohorts that belong to the treatment 1 zone, meaning the Western region where the FP program was implemented, we can say much involving of parents in the education of their kids. And overall in the treatment 1 zone, the zone where the FP program was implemented, we can see also an impact. To conclude, the FP program has increased the school enrollment and the probability of completing education, primary education for FP cohort within the Western region compared to the same cohort in the control location. Overall, the effects are larger for female, and there is a strong evidence of spillover effect in neighboring communities in Nigeria, but not much to say about the cross-country spillover. The FP program is also associated with an increase in community engagement. The awareness of the program, given its size and popularity, likely inspire increased education in the subsequent generation in neighboring areas, especially for female. So what that is implies that the step that the government has taken to increase the access and quality of education has been followed by population. But what is important to notice here is that it's because this meet the requirements. First of all, the missionary school, they didn't trust to that. And as this was moved to something that they can rely on, it was in the local language, and the government participates a lot in it by increasing the share of the budget devoted to education. We notice that the population also participates. We also find impact on the next generation and the neighboring community. That is something that is useful for intra-regional, how can I say, intra-regional collaboration. So thank you. I will leave it there.
Thank you so much, Léonie, and perfect timekeeping. Justin, the bar has been set.
That was impressive, as well as interesting. Right. That looked like me. Yes. All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Good to be back at RISE after being away and seeing so many people after so much time. So this is a paper with Alexis, who is here, and Laura, who is not, on the long-run decline of education quality in the developing world. I think the existence of a learning crisis around the world is sort of one of the motivating facts of the RISE program and of a lot of work that happens in global education now. And when we started this paper, we realized that we'd spent a lot of time trying to improve the measurement of learning outcomes around the world and even the comparability to be able to say that kids in poorer countries are lagging so far behind, we realized we didn't really have a good notion of whether that was a new phenomenon or something that's been around for a long time. Both are bad. We want to remedy it in either case, but it is informative in terms of diagnosing the causes if we understand whether this is something that can be attributed to recent policy reforms or is sort of a long-standing situation. So what we set out to do in this paper is to try to put together long-term trends in education quality for as many countries as we could. And I want to also say that, like, we're come to this towards the end. I mean, we talk about a learning crisis, whereas we all know, and we can look up on the WDI and confirm it, that like there's more literate people in the world now than there's ever been, right? We're in a period of like the highest learning levels the world has ever seen in absolute terms. And I think what we all understand is like what we're concerned about is conditional on going to school. Maybe that's not the case. Maybe we're not on the best of all times. Well, that's where the question mark is, and that's what we kind of want to establish here. So we're going to try to establish some really simple descriptive facts at a very 30,000-foot level. How we do it, this kind of went viral from one of my former colleagues, Pam Jakila, on Twitter, XKCD, types of a development economics paper. I've written many of these. Like, look, I randomized. I won't go into all of the others. But this one is really, did you know you can combine lots of DHS data sets into one? Pam didn't even know I was working on this, and like, sure enough. It also fits some of the others. I mean, Lant's written some of these. So maybe it's not the unadulterated schools, they're good, but I still do want to come back with a schools, they're good being the message of the paper at the end. But this is really what we're doing, which is taking all the DHS data sets from 87 countries, 300 and some rounds, putting them together, so repeated cross-sections. The key for us is going to be to have at least 3 rounds of DHS surveys, you'll see why, from a given country to be able to put together the trends that we want. Okay, so it's really 3 parts. First, how do we measure education quality? A graph from like the beginning of RISE. I didn't even do it again. I just pasted it up here. It still has the typo. That's Liberia, not Lebanon. So highest grade attained, 0 to 8. Just to measure what proportion of women aged 25 to 34 would be literate with that many years of schooling. You'd hope that shoots up to 100 pretty quickly, but of course it doesn't. And as you can see, around the world, you kind of span the range from Sierra Leone down here at like 10% of women with 7 or 8 years of schooling can read a single sentence, up to Burundi and Rwanda with 100% literacy conditional on that level of schooling. So the quality range is huge. And that is, if you draw a line through this at 5 years of schooling, that's essentially the measure of education quality that we're going to use throughout here. How literate is an adult woman predicted to be with 5 years of schooling? You can say that's not education quality. Fine. That's semantics. I think we're measuring very well what we're doing. Whether you want to call it education quality or literacy conditional on schooling, you can like search and replace my entire presentation with literacy conditional on schooling if that's more acceptable. Okay. And if you look at that, that measure correlates quite well with the World Bank harmonized learning outcomes. It correlates with per capita GDP. It correlates with lots of stuff in ways that you would expect it to across countries. Now, to trends, because where we're headed is trends. And the question is, how do we get trends out of repeated cross-sections? And we need to talk about 3 kinds of time: age, period, and cohorts. Are there any sociologists or demographers in the room? There must be some. I mean, for demographers, this is like what you do, and economists don't do it that often, but there's a little corner of economists who do it. The challenge is that we've got, this is literacy rate. We've just taken the women with 4 to 6 years of schooling. This is the raw literacy rate. And this is all the different DHSs, and this is the year of birth. And so Indonesia is a really simple case, which is like, can you read a single sentence? That level of literacy, if you've made it to 4 to 6 years of schooling, is pretty good in Indonesia, and it seems to have been pretty flat. And so is it survey effects? Is it age? Yeah, Indonesia. We can spend a lot of time, but it doesn't make a lot of difference. It's all kind of flat. But you get to other countries, and you can see things get very messy. So here's Ethiopia, which has had these 5 rounds of DHSs. And you can try to say, well, what's happening to literacy rates in in Ethiopia, and you could pick a single survey and kind of look at the different women of different ages and try to do it that way. But if you take a woman born in 1970 and interview her in 2000, and then you come back 5 years later, the literacy rate seems to be very different, right? So that's either something's happening in Ethiopia that everybody's forgetting how to read, or something happens over your life cycle, right? So there's cohorts. Well, let's go to my slide. The real problem here is there's 3 different kinds of time we need to worry about. In our context, age. Literacy could accumulate or decay over time. If you're a farmer and you got educated 10 years ago, maybe you've forgotten things. Period. In other contexts, period effects can mean different things. In our context, I think it's best to think of them as just survey round effects. A given survey round could produce quirky statistics. If you talk to the DHS people, they're very open, like, oh yeah, no, the 1999 Nigeria DHS is a mess. Why did you use that? Like, oh, okay. And that one's actually true for our Nigeria friends online. The cohort effects are what we're really after, which is that some cohorts generally got better education than others did. That's what we want to try to distinguish. The problem is like the fundamental collinearity here. Your age is the period in which we're interviewing you minus the year you were born. So you cannot, if you want a really flexible functional form, you cannot identify all 3 of these things. And you just have to assume your way out of the problem. And the literature is full of different ways of assuming your way out of the problem. To make a long, Alexis crying is like months of work figuring out the right way to do this. And I'm just going to skip over and say, the Deaton-Paxson kind of recommended solution is just assume that there are no trends in the period effects. Like some surveys may be wonky or whatever, but like the surveys are not getting systematically better or worse over time. Those are mean 0 survey effects. Then you can identify this. We go a little further and we say that the age effects are quadratic to simplify things. But okay, so then you go back to that Ethiopia picture, and if you apply those assumptions, then you can disentangle. Over time, as we saw, if that woman born in 1970 does seem to be losing literacy over her life cycle, right? It could have gone the other way. Could have been you leave school, you get a job, and you need to read, and you accumulate literacy over time. And there are a couple of countries in which that's true. But for the most part, it's usually flat or slightly negative. Period effects. There is sort of a consistent shift right there in Ethiopia. So it seems to be mostly an age effect and not a period effect. And then once we've extracted all those things, we get what we're after, which is the quote-unquote quality of education in Ethiopia over time, from the cohort born in 1950 all the way to the cohort born in the late 1990s. And we see they're kind of flat for about 2 to 3 decades in Ethiopia, and then since about the time that I was born, declining. If we can do the same thing for Nigeria, where again, it's really not that difficult because all the surveys seem to stack right on top of each other. There is a little bit of an age decay effect. Surveys bump around very slightly, but what we see is from about the 1950s that we were just talking about, which is as far back as we can go, there's that decline through the 60s to the 70s, kind of flattening out in the 80s and the 1990s. That's basically what we're doing in this paper. I have 6 more minutes to just talk to you more about it. But, Indonesia, I think we can have a conversation. Like, what we're seeing here in Indonesia is perfectly flat, no decline. And I know, whoop, there's Amanda. It could very well be that we're seeing, or you're seeing declines for higher order skills, which could be consistent with people still knowing how to read a single sentence. But I think it's probably worth us. I'd love to understand more what you guys are seeing from the Rise Indonesia team. So pooling those all together, the 2 facts that I kind of started off with. Unconditional literacy rates, all these gray squiggly lines are an individual country. Pool them by regions. Unconditional literacy rates, up, up, and up, right? The ranking of regions kind of staying constant, except for South Asia, kind of pushing up above Sub-Saharan Africa. I think that's what we knew and expected. What I think we didn't really know or necessarily expect was if we start looking at expected literacy at grade 5, our measure of quality, we see kind of flat lines in Latin America, East Asia, and the Middle East, and these fairly steep downward trends in both South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. Those are the cohort effects And that's our measure of education quality. Men, DHS sometimes does this with the men and sometimes doesn't. So the samples are smaller. We don't have enough surveys even to do the Middle East or Latin America. But the African and South Asian result looks fairly similar for the men as well as the women. Okay, now, half of you are sitting there going, yeah, but it's entirely that there's a bunch more kids in school now, and you brought in all the kids who didn't make it into school before, and the schools haven't gotten any worse. It's just, different kids in and different learning results out. My answer is going to be, yeah, maybe. I still think we should care about the downward trend, even if it is affected by the composition of kids. But I think there's some evidence that it's not entirely that. But I want to be clear that we're like informally bounding this, wondering whether we should do a more formal bounding exercise. But for now, just suggestive evidence, and two pieces of evidence. One, selection patterns have for sure changed. We need an indicator of your health or wealth before you went to school. Remember, we're doing this all off of interviews with adult women, and we don't care what their socioeconomic status is now. The question is, what was it before? DHS doesn't give you a lot to go with there, but what we do have, and a candidate suggested in the literature, used in a lot of papers, is to use adult height as a measure of deprivation when you were a kid. The idea being that your height was mostly determined before your schooling was. Overall height is rising in the sample, not for every country. So this is trend in height, change in centimeters per year in the average woman over multiple decades, rising in most countries, but not all. And as you can see, for the most part, the trend for all women is to the right of the trend for women with schooling, which you have to squint and think about this every time, but is what you would expect if the disadvantaged kids are moving into the schooling system. And so that brings down the trend in height for women with schooling. Okay? So we are seeing a change in selection. There is as we would have thought. Long story short, fine. Throw that into there as a control is the best we can do for now. And my story about what happened to the quality of education in Ethiopia changes like not at all. And to some extent, it's because height only has so much explanatory power, but it doesn't seem to move the needle at all on that trend. The same thing going for Nigeria and across the board. That global picture I showed you doesn't change. Finally, did quality trends change when fees changed? Back to the FPE experiments we just talked about, or natural experiments. If you think it's all about when bunches of kids came into the system, this is percentage of women with 5 years of schooling. The line is at the FPE reform. This is Ethiopia. And sure enough, years of schooling kind of kinked upwards. And yes, some evidence. So I cherry-picked countries with the biggest kink here in terms of years of schooling. Where did FPE have punch on schooling? And then the question is, did it change the quality? Maybe there was a kink there in Ethiopia. I'm not going to live or die on that hill. All I really want you to take away is that it wasn't going up beforehand, right? That's the story. This doesn't need to be a selection story. Maybe FPE made the schools worse and the TFP of the production function of schools went down, about overcrowding or who knows what. My story is about this was already a decline even before that reform, and that's true in all of the cases with the biggest kinks in terms of enrollment with FPE, Madagascar and Mali, and so on. So to wrap up, over the last 50 years, literacy in the developing world has boomed. Never been better. Education quality, measured here as literacy per year of schooling, has stagnated or declined. And the cross-country gaps in education quality started off huge, from a 90% chance of being literate after 5 years to a 10% chance of being literate after 5 years. And that's mostly just stayed the same. The countries that were way behind are still way behind a half century later. Selection certainly drives some of that, the downward trend. That said, students are healthier and wealthier than ever before. And the decline predates the abolition of fees in most countries. There we go.
Ben.
Nice job with the timing, Justin. I think you pressed the button. It couldn't have been that perfect.
cause and effect.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name is Ben Piper. I work with the Gates Foundation, and I want to greet everybody, but particularly the team in Nigeria. I feel like you've been left out for a while, so greetings from me. I'm going to talk today about a set of interviews I've done with educationists from all over the world. So the title is The Wisdom of the International Education Sector's Elders, Lessons for How to Improve Learning. Now, if I interviewed you and you're not an elder, don't be offended. You're an elder with respect to your wisdom, not your age. But the motivation for this study and presentation today is that I have a new job. And the thing I know to do when I have a new job or an old job or a new thing is to do some research around it. So this is a very simple attempt to understand the sector's view of what you would tell a new person entering into a new role on the donor side of things. So basically what we have are a bunch of interviews with experts across the sector. And I asked those of you who are in this room who are part of this study, I asked you a bunch of questions, but they were bracketed and bucketed into 4 different research questions that I wanted to know. Number 1, before I became a donor, I wanted to ask you this first question, which is, what are the characteristics of an effective donor? And some of these people are on the donor side, some are on the research side, some are on the policy-making side, and some are on the implementer side. And so you have a range of experiences. And I really wanted to know, before I became one, what you think made someone good at this. Because I think you might tell me a different story now than you did then. What are the characteristics of an effective donor, as well as what are the characteristics of a bad one? People had a lot of things to say on that level. And then particularly for the foundation, what would you say that we should do to improve or change in our work in the sector? Critically, what are the key technical things that you thought were an opportunity to support? What are the things we should do? And then critically, what are the things we should stop doing? Not just us, but the overall sector. And then I had a research question I won't spend a lot of time on, but I do want to call out that I asked everybody I've talked to since then, what are the technically strong local education partners in sub-Saharan Africa? And the results of that portion of the study were pretty sad as far as the new things. So that's a task for us, as both here in RISE as well as us in the broader sector. So let me headline for you some of the key findings. By the way, this first one was somewhat of a surprise to me. I was expecting that working for an organization that's focused on improving learning outcomes, that the people I talked to would say, by the way, this is the wrong direction, you should go a different way. But there was resounding, not unanimous, but resounding support for prioritizing improving learning outcomes and lower primary as the fundamental thing that the sector should be doing, and us in particular at the foundation. There was real guidance on the attributes of effective and ineffective grant makers, which we'll see how well I apply. The third one is that there was quite a bit of suggestions on what we should continue supporting teachers. That's been a theme for a lot of the presentations so far, that the teaching task is difficult. Teachers need support. Another one was about the idea of connecting research and implementation. How does RISE and RISE researchers and RISE affiliated researchers, or just people who are here at RISE today, how do we make sure the research that you're doing is connected to the daily tasks of implementation, fundamentally touching those teachers? And then critically, given the title of RISE, how do we embed change into systems? There are a bunch of things that the sector should stop. I'll just go bucketing them right now. One is the ineffective teacher training, just having a conversation over tea about, is it that all teacher professional development, is it all in-service teacher training that's ineffective? I think Dave and others have a paper that showed that there are some teacher training, in-service teacher training programs that are effective, but those are not the typical ones. There are some design considerations that make some trainings more effective than others, but not all trainings, if not most trainings, are not designed that way. A second one is really important in an organization like mine. It's the short program cycles. How can we, and the funding that we do, as well as the sort of pushes we make in the sector, how can we make sure that we're not just doing this one-off and then moving on quite quickly? How do we make sure we stick with something to deal with the complex changes that Simon talked about? And the critical one is, how do we stop imposing Western and Northern perspectives? Now, a lot of this is selection bias. Maybe this is because, as someone who's interested in these things, I talk to a lot of people from Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, which are the technical areas of focus for the foundation. But I think that's a really resounding one, is that we're going to be effective. In my experiences, we're going to be much more effective if the ideas, perspectives, designs are driven by people from the context that we care about. So let me go back to the top first question. What are the characteristics of an effective donor? Here are some quotes from the International Education Elders. Respect those on the ground who have a better knowledge of what's happening. On the other hand, respect and leverage the donor's global knowledge. I'm not sure where you think the balance is between those things, but I think that's number one. Be clear about the thesis about what you're trying to change, and be consistent and work around that change. This one was humbling as a new Gates staff member, that we have undue influence. How do you acknowledge that dynamic, but really find how to be humble? I want to be a learner from all of you. Don't move the goalposts or change the rules of the game. This is, I think, a complaint about a lot of the donors in the room, including us, at least not without fair warning. Obviously, things shift, but how do we treat partners in shifts? The bottom one is really about the size of our particular foundation. Our funding is quite small relative. Well, I can say both sides of that. It's huge, but it's also really small with relative terms with respect to other donors in the sector. So our influence is more likely to be about ideas and capabilities than actually funding physical things, the trainings, implementation ourselves. The next one is about the idea of silos, how are programs connecting? And then I think this is in general terms for anybody in the room. What can you do that others can't? That really goes to my view of development. The only reason I'm sticking in this space is because there are things that I can do and support that others can't. That means I have to learn fast, because people in these contexts learn the skills I have quite quickly. So if I'm going to validate myself being in this field for a long time, I need to learn something new. Otherwise, I'm not either learning or I'm not being effective in making sure those things are shared. Working how to bring together collaborative, creating a community of practice. So I didn't put some of the negative quotes, but these are some of the positive ones on the characteristics of an effective donor. In particular for us, I suppose this is in general, what are the things that the Gates Foundation should do? These were kind of related to just us. What should we be doing differently? If you have 100 priorities, you have exactly 0. The definition of priorities. Stop teaching things that aren't reading if they can't read. And I think really importantly, the connection between foundation literacy, numeracy, and skills. It's nonsense for us to say that we are choosing between skills, socio-emotional learning, and literacy and numeracy. That's nonsense. These things are fundamental to that. But whether you are doing it just because you like seeing little kids read, which is a wonderful experience, or because you want to make sure that the broader community in the international education sector has a strong pathway to the workforce, the kids who are going to eventually become young people, who are eventually going to be workers, need these basic skills. These things are not dichotomous. You have to have them connected, and focusing on NFLN, as I've heard from you, is really important. And then the space for data. Some real challenges that we got in the work that the foundation has done. There's too much focus on reading. FLN, if you call it foundation literacy and numeracy, a full half is about numeracy. So how can we push more for numeracy? And I have kind of adapted that slightly. It's not just pushing more on numeracy, it's considering the experience of an individual teacher who is both supposed to improve literacy and supposed to improve numeracy. And in the few programs that have both, the design of the numeracy interventions are often completely contradictory to the design of the literacy programs. So we're saying FLN, yes, do both. But the teacher says, oh, here's a program that looks one way for literacy and is fundamentally different for numeracy. So how can we simplify the task, the instructional change process that many of you talked about? How can we make it easier for the typical rural teacher and not cause the problem ourselves by the lack of integration between these things? So others raise concerns about positioning FLN as the only priority, making sure we're linking it to other outcomes. And as I said earlier, kind of the literacy, numeracy stuff being a stepping stone to improving upper primary and secondary. We don't have the same amount of data on secondary and upper primary learning outcomes. I think that Sierra Leone study we saw is one of the few that really has strong relationships between the sort of structured approaches that they tried, and learning outcomes. That's one to study if you haven't looked at it in much more depth. But my hunch is the sort of things that are going to work at scale inside of government systems to improve learning outcomes in lower primary are meaningful lessons in upper primary or secondary. And it would be I'm going fast, but stay with me. It would be heartbreaking for us to not have enough success in the primary foundational phase. We say, oh, let's just move on to another thing. And we start off in secondary as if we've learned nothing about how to improve learning outcomes on lower primary. Are you with me? Yeah. So we have to do well. If those of us, not everyone in this room is bought into this FLN stuff, but regardless, we have to do well to improve lower primary outcomes so that the lessons from that, not all of them are going to be exactly the same, but there are some lessons for that, particularly the systems and scales point of view, that can be useful for the broader sector. Sorry, I got excited. So our third question are kind of ideas. What are the technical things that we should support, not just we, but the broader sector? Number one, on implementation, the implementation bucket. Narrow the gap between policy and implementation. The circular that's written from the capital means a very different thing for the teacher implementing it. How can we connect those things? And how do we get evidence actually integrated into program designs? That connection of, even in my team, making sure that when they have an idea of a new thing we can fund, what's the evidence for that thing? It's not straightforward. Learning will come from doing. We know enough now to do good work. So, working with government. If you don't work within the structures of government, there will be inefficiencies. The typical task of a mid-level civil servant, you saw those Ghana districts that were talked about before. What does their daily life look like? And how does this learning improvement emphasis that a lot of us have, how does that affect the daily life of that mid-level civil servant? Often it doesn't at all. That's a design issue. Help us improve systems and capacity so that the talented people in sub-Saharan Africa can have the institutions they deserve. And outcomes will happen. Teachers, teachers, teachers. I focus on teachers, I focus on pedagogy. Training teachers is essential to scale. Supporting them, doing that in a way that's evidence-based is fundamental. Partners, we talked about yesterday, for those of you who were there, the importance of investing in the capacity of the next generation of African researchers. That's what the quote was. But they also, for us, we're thinking about the research side as well as the implementation side. There are very talented people who know how to improve learning outcomes much better than any single one of us who are in these countries. How can we make sure they have the place and ability to do the research that applies to their sector, as well as to design, lead, and implement the programs that are going to make the biggest difference. So those are some of the things you told me. Now I'm saying it's strong, but these were your ideas. The fourth one, what are the things we shouldn't support? Short sprints. We got to stick with this stuff over time. How do you work in a way that builds capacity as opposed to taking it away? And this idea of northern and western ideas. Where's the germ of an idea? I'm proud that so many of the things that have worked well and the things that I've been connected to are not my idea. I said yesterday in the session, my job is to be an idea person, but that is not new. That is my view for a long time. The ideas are going to solve the quality of education in sub-Saharan Africa and India already exist in these countries. How can we find the people who have them and validate, support, make those things work better? Someone should say amen to that one, because that one's very true. Yeah. Number 4. Going to the last point. Who are the technically strong local education partners in sub-Saharan Africa? In particular, we're also working in India, but we really have strong partners there already. We have strong partners in sub-Saharan Africa, but how can we make them less underrepresented, both on the research side and implementation side? I'm proud to be connected to a few of them and are really doing a great job. When I asked this question, a small number of partners were mentioned multiple times, and they often had a very Anglophone bent. Maybe that's a selection bias, given my very American language abilities. You know what I mean by that. And then how do we make sure we're doing a better job of connecting with organizations working on FLN across the continent? I'm wrapping up soon. Here are our overall conclusions. I have one slide after this. We, based on this evidence, as well as the analysis of the foundation, we're going to really focus on improving learning outcomes. That's the ultimate story, but with particular emphasis in the short term on responding to learning loss. The good thing is that the sector has evidence of things that can work to improve outcomes at scale. We are in a different era than we used to be. We have evidence of things that can work to improve outcomes at scale. There's a bunch of reports to show them. 3 of the ones that we're really interested in are structured pedagogy, teaching at the right level, and remediation. There's overlaps between those. We have a research focus for global ed. I won't go into all those. I guess I should because it's RISE. Comparability of 4.1.1a and 4.1.1b, research connected to implementation. It is inevitable if you're implementing something. Your program will fail in some parts of the country. The question is how fast you find that out. Going to Simon's point, maybe the differentiation between the programs had a lot of schools making movement is how quickly the government realized that the ones in the middle weren't doing the program. Are you finding that out 2 years later? The teachers have already given up. If you're finding that out quickly, you can have impacts happen. Consider scale and systems, as we talked about, and as I think it's critical to emphasize, to have an ongoing eye on the typical teacher using the typical pedagogical methods in a typical rural school. That changing that setting, helping that process of change is fundamental. In the paper I wrote related to this is the last paragraph. I won't read it. I've highlighted some of the things I want to emphasize. What are the partners on the ground? How do we make sure we're supporting teachers to deliver these things effectively? How do we get into the details of classroom pedagogy, the choices that individual teachers make about how to teach? Kane's presentation on, we have increased knowledge, pedagogical content knowledge in Ethiopia, but the pedagogy is bad. My dissertation was in every region in Ethiopia. You asked teachers about this new reform that they were doing 15 years, I won't tell you how old I am, but a few years ago. They could tell you the program, they could talk about student-centeredness. When you observe their classrooms and measure student-centeredness, there was no difference from those that were trained from those who were not. It is not just having these programs implemented, spread, it's whether the individual teacher in the rural area are using those things in their choices daily. How do we respond to inevitable implementation challenges? How do we do this with government systems? And the last thing to say is how do we do it at scale? Anything good with this was done by Izzy, who worked on a lot of this in the back, as well as all of the international education elders that shared this knowledge. Anything bad was me. Thank you.
Okay, great. Well, indeed, it is so great to be back here at an in-person RISE conference. It's been far too long. And I'm excited to present on some of this new work I've been doing on purpose-driven education systems and the role that we believe that purpose plays in how education systems shift. And so to start with, I want to start with a puzzle. And so this puzzle is the case of Vietnam, which we've heard a bit about over the last few days and this morning as well. And Vietnam participated in the PISA assessments in 2015 and 2018 and just performed exceedingly higher than would be expected based on its level of income or level of development, and surpassed OECD learning levels on some of these learning measures and just performed very well. This graph digs a little bit more deeply into some comparisons with other middle-income countries that participated in the PISA-D assessments. And when you dig into it and compare these 15-year-old students in the other middle-income countries with the students in Vietnam, on average, the Vietnamese students are scoring about 200 PISA points higher than the other students, which is the equivalent of about 8 years worth of learning. So this is just an enormous gap in achievement that we can see in this country. And so you can see there that Vietnamese students far outperform children even of similar demographic and socioeconomic characteristics and even from wealthier countries. And I want to start with a second puzzle. And that puzzle is the case of Sobral, Brazil. So Sobral is a municipality in Brazil. It's among the poorer municipalities in Brazil. It's in the state of Pará, which is among the poorer states in Brazil. And over the course of about a 12-year period, that municipality undertook a series of education reforms, which led it to rise from, as you can see there, being ranked the 1,366th municipality in the country to the top-ranked municipality on a national learning assessment. And so in the graph, you can see that while most of Sobral's schools are in the second lowest SES category, they're now outperforming pretty consistently nearly all of the schools of higher SES status. And so what explains these kinds of learning achievements? So in these examples, higher income or resources and or greater knowledge of what works to achieve learning improvements cannot explain the differences that we observe in these learning outcomes. These examples and others that I can point to leave us with these much more complex questions of how and why success was achieved in these contexts. And so in this presentation, I'm going to propose a conceptual framework for understanding some of these drivers of education system performance. And I'm going to use it to argue that a commitment to the purpose of learning is a critical missing link to addressing the learning crisis and to kind of how we think about addressing the learning crisis. And then I'm going to apply that conceptual framework to examples that we have of successful system shifts. And then finally, I'm going to describe some of the efforts that we've seen and observe that have fostered and kind of facilitated a commitment to the purpose of learning in a variety of contexts. And so to start, for our conceptual framework, we borrow from the organizational management literature, which holds that organizations have at their core a technical core that produces the value for that organization. And then that core is supported by support functions that enable it to function. And so within an organization's technical core is that organization's purpose. So this is the set of strongly held beliefs about why that organization exists, what it's meant to achieve, what the expectations are of people who are within that organization. And then in an effective organization, that's then paired with technical practices which provide the technical skills and the know-how that's necessary for achieving that purpose. And that technical core is then supported by these support functions which kind of create the operating conditions and the infrastructure that's necessary for the technical core to produce that value. So human resources and IT and legal and procurement and things like this. And so purpose takes different forms as well in different organizations. So in some contexts, this purpose is going to be fairly explicit. So for example, a hospital might have the purpose of providing high quality health care. If it's an effective hospital, it would pair that with technical practices like highly skilled doctors and nurses with the technical know-how necessary. And it would pair that, again, with support functions in support of achieving that purpose. So IT systems aligned for that, hiring practices aligned for that as well. But in some organizations, the purpose is much more implicit, hidden, maybe unobserved. And so for an example here, just to pick a little bit on tech companies because they're easy to pick on, but you can think of maybe a social media company that claims its purpose is to maybe change the world for the better, when in fact it's kind of only moderately hidden purpose is really just to maximize advertising dollars, right? Okay, so what we hold in this paper is that these same three characteristics that drive organizational performance also drive system performance, and in particular drive education system performance. Okay, so if we think all three of these characteristics work together to drive performance, then we can step back and say, okay, what are we researching? What are we evaluating? What are we implementing? And what kind of practice are we doing on the ground? And so when you look at interventions that are done, most interventions focus either on technical practices, things like teacher training, things that increase technical skills and know-how, or on support functions, expanding EMIS systems, procuring more inputs, things like this. But the purpose receives relatively and comparatively little attention, and we argue that it's a missing link in thinking about how to address the learning crisis. And so when we look out across education systems today, there's many forms of purpose that we can observe in education systems. And so these are just a few examples to put out there. And so one form that we see are education systems in contexts where there's been a maintenance of an elite-focused education system. So in these contexts, that purpose would often be implicit. It's not usually going to be explicit. It might include expansion of schooling for the masses, but quality education has maybe been reserved primarily for an elite cadre. An example of this would be, the way that our friends Karthik Muralidharan and Abhijit Singh refer to the India system as not primarily an education system, but rather a selection system. Its main purpose is to select top performers for more schooling and good jobs, provide schooling to the masses, but with much less regard for the learning outcomes. Another form that we see purpose taking are contexts where there's contested purpose, and obviously these all overlap in places. These aren't kind of exclusive categories. But these would be contexts where the system maybe has too many purposes. And so even if all of them are good and legitimate purposes, the system might be pulled in too many different directions to be able to achieve them all. There might be contradictory purposes. There might be outright disagreement or infighting within the system about what purpose it's trying to work towards. And so an example here could be education systems that maybe nominally have been tasked with providing a high-quality education for all children. Maybe that same education system is tasking its teachers with completing the curriculum syllabus every single year, regardless of maybe the learning levels in their classroom, tasking teachers with preparing children for, high-stakes exams, and these other tasks that might actually be contradictory with the original purpose of providing a quality education. Another form that we see purpose take is contexts where maybe the purpose has been corrupted. So the purpose has been hijacked or supplanted by other, maybe hidden purposes. These purposes might include things like rents for officials, contractors through procurement, patronage networks, things like this. And then finally, education systems that have been repurposed in a way that encompasses a purpose of learning for all. So these would be contexts that include the establishment of learning as a fundamental purpose of the education system, followed by the actions necessary to then support this purpose. And so what we're arguing in this is that this commitment to this purpose of learning may be a necessary, even if it's not a sufficient condition, we're not arguing it's sufficient, but a necessary condition for achieving the kind of large-scale learning improvements that we want to see in so many education systems. And so now I want to apply that conceptual framework to success cases that we have in examples. So this is the Sobral case that I mentioned at the beginning. And so when you dig into the story of Sobral and look at what happened there, what we argue is that what kind of was at the heart of some of these reforms was an establishment of the purpose of learning. And so an assessment that was conducted by the municipality found that 40% of primary school students were unable to read. That, along with many other factors and conditions that were in place in the municipality, led those municipal leaders to establish learning as a core purpose by setting really clear and committed goals for universal literacy in the first 2 years of primary school. They set goals for remediation for older children who had already moved out of those first 2 years of primary school. And then I think an important factor there too was that then they kind of filtered that commitment to the purpose of learning through all the other levels of the system. So it wasn't just a kind of a top-down command and control, but they filtered this kind of commitment and dedication to the goal to the other levels of the system as well. From that establishment of this purpose, then they implemented all sorts of improvements to technical practices, right? They supported teachers, they provided new materials to them, they did classroom observations and coaching and things like this. And they implemented improvements to support functions. They introduced meritocratic hiring of principals and adapted information systems to include learning-based monitoring. And then from that package of those characteristics or those actions that were done, we argue, is how they were able to achieve these large learning gains that they saw. And so a second example, which I won't go into for the sake of time, but just to say there was also a large curriculum reform in Tanzania, which provides another case where we're arguing that there was this establishment of the purpose of learning and a commitment to specific learning goals that was followed by kind of aligned actions in a way that allowed them to achieve pretty substantial learning improvements there. And also just to say, I'm focused here on success cases because I prefer to be a positive person and kind of like to do optimistic examples. But in the paper, we also use the same framework to kind of to try to explain places where things don't work. And so interventions that maybe focus too much on technical practices or support functions in places where that purpose wasn't in place to try to explain some of the kind of null results that we see. Or just lack of sustainable results that we see in a lot of cases. And so if we're arguing that this commitment to the purpose of learning is so important, how have we seen it fostered or facilitated in different contexts? And so there's a few that we draw in the paper. There's other ways as well, but these are 3 that we highlight. And so one is conducting or funding learning assessments to spur kind of this political and citizen-led attention and pressure to act. So a common theme across the success cases that we see is that there was usually some introduction of new information on low learning into the system. Again, there's lots of places where that happens, where action is not taken on learning. It's not a sufficient condition, but it might be a necessary condition to start launching some of those processes. And new information also can help to strengthen and empower people who are within the system, who are maybe already champions of learning, but need that kind of a little more, something to point to or pull from to try to bring about change from within their own systems as well. A second example is supporting domestic think and do tanks. These civil society actors, I think many of which we heard Ben referring to as well, can often have an outsized influence on what politicians and other leaders in a system prioritize and act on. We have many examples from within the RISE network, but also beyond it as well, where these kinds of actors have played a really significant role in shifting the priorities within a system. And then third, funding programs and scholarships for tomorrow's leaders. So investing in tomorrow's leaders today. And so this takes a long-term view. It's not a typical kind of education project, if you will, but it aligns with the theory of change of some organizations like Teach for All. There's also efforts from beyond the education space and beyond the education sector that have taken this kind of approach that I think the education sector could learn from. And then just to close out, this is a quote from a researcher that's a part of our, well, it's probably a paraphrased quote, to be honest, but it is aligned at least with something that a researcher from our Vietnamese team said. And I gave the Vietnam example up at the top, and we have a country research team investigating how did Vietnam achieve these kind of outsized learning achievements and outcomes. And when asked, how do they do this? How do they achieve this? The researchers can give all sorts of reasons and factors and conditions, and when you say, yeah, but what really made the difference? The systems that change are the ones that want to change. Vietnam wanted those high education outcomes. They were committed to it at a societal level, and from that flowed the other factors and conditions that enabled them to achieve that kind of change. And so what we're arguing is we think that commitment to this kind of purpose of learning is a key condition that can help drive and achieve the kind of system shifts that we want to see to achieve the large learning improvements that we want. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Could we, by the way, the women, one on the time. Yeah, thanks. Oh. Could you come and sit down at the front? Ben, Justin, and Michelle. And Léonie, you're still online. Fantastic. So what we're going to do, Justin, are we okay to go to Abuja first? Okay. We've obviously had a little bit of problems connecting with our colleagues in Abuja, so we're going to give them the opportunity to ask their questions first. They've been relaying them to Justin, who will read them out, and then we'll go to the floor here. Okay?
Yeah, great. Yeah, lots of questions from the hub because they haven't had a chance for a while. So I bundled a few together. I think they were getting at the same thing. Therefore, Léonie, does the study on free education in Nigeria consider or have lessons for the contemporary challenges in Nigeria, particularly incomplete primary education and out-of-school children? Thanks, Rosti. And then there was another question for Ben, which was how do we think about balancing so-called, in quotes, education quality and local relevance? For example, assuming students can't read complete sentences in English, but they reside in a context where Kiswahili is the relevant local language, and maybe they are proficient in that language. So how to think about that issue?
Léonie, did you hear that question okay? Would you like to start, if you did? We can't hear you.
Yeah, let me repeat it to be sure that I understood. So the question is about the challenge of not completing the primary education in grade 6. Instead they are completing it in grade 5, right?
Answer more broadly from how does your research inform contemporary challenges within the Nigerian education system, of which that is one?
Okay. So before I start answering, let me say that there are two facts to be considered in this study. First of all, we are talking about a study that lasts for the moment my parents were kids. So it's like, it's not the time where my parents were deciding on schooling issue, but in the time where my grandparents were deciding. So when we were collecting data, it was very challenging to get the accurate information on that period. But I can say also that we are still working, and we have another round of data collection to be completed soon. So the results are very preliminary. We didn't consider what the question is talking about in the study from the result that I have now, but we should further consider it in the next step of the study.
Okay, great. Ben, education quality in local context.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the issue of how do we make sure that the assessments and the measures that we're applying to determine quality apply to the local country and in Nigeria and in Kenya. I think the example you gave of assessing kids in English, but their first language is Kiswahili, I think it's actually more complicated that even in Kenya, where Kiswahili is more of a second language than a first language for a large portion of the population that's not on the coast. So the first study that I actually led in Kenya measured one kid in 3 languages. So you measure their mother tongue, you measure Kiswahili, you measure English, and you look at how those relationships differ. And the basic story was kids could decode English, but comprehended their local language better. Just a mess, because it's such an inefficient system at the time, because they were getting most of their instruction in a language that they ultimately didn't comprehend, and the languages they did comprehend, they weren't getting instruction in, so they couldn't decode. So a lot of the languages in Kenya, as well as elsewhere in Africa, have diacritics on the letters, but the kids had no idea what those diacritics were, but they could decode complex English words, but they didn't understand it. So anyway, point being, with respect to your question, I think it's really important to start off from an understanding of what's happening locally and design research studies and implementation that takes that into account, thinking of those first languages, second languages, and critically, how they interact. One of the things I'm really interested in at the moment is actually not just whether kids can read, but whether or not those skills for reading can transfer as the children move up throughout the primary cycle, wherever the kind of the transition to the L2 or L3 is. That's a really important thing, and it has to be related to what the countries want and what the country's policies are with respect to language and with respect to outcomes in upper primary and secondary.
We have a couple more questions from the hub.
Yeah, 2 more questions from the Nigeria hub, both for Léonie, maybe unsurprisingly. One is, what were the policies or strategies the government used to achieve success in the free primary education program? And the second question, can you explain the reason for the sharp decline in education completion for the control group post-FPE?
Can I go ahead?
Please go ahead if you had them. Yep.
Okay, thank you. So the strategy that I can mention is that I already talked about it during my presentation. First of all, the education was made in the local language. Formerly, that was not the case. That was not the case, and this is the fact that due to that reason, parents didn't want to go to send their kids to school because they're thinking that a religious study, arithmetic and reading is like another kind of oppression of the population. Because at that time in 1916 and some year before that, all the West African countries, they are preparing to the independence. So it was, the people just didn't want more in such kind of oppression. So the government that came into power at that time make it to in local language that help population to ensure their kids. And the second thing, there were a lot of budgets devoted to that. There were massive recruitment of teachers. There were also building construction. So all those kind of strategies help to ensure that everyone, every family send its kid to school. I don't know if I answered the question. The second one, we didn't find a sharp decrease on completion. The decrease that we find is the normal trend of decreasing from pre-FP time period till FP and until after FP period. So it's like something that we should see normally in the control region. And we didn't see that in the treatment region because we have, in fact, a policy, a reform that motivate people to send their kids to school. But we find a sharp decrease in the attendance. And this way, the reasons are still to be investigated because I have some reason in mind, but I cannot ensure that this, for instance, in that period, there were cutting of some region to another region. For instance, in the Western region, they were cutting they created the Mid-Western region by cutting some part of the Western region. So I cannot ensure that for the control area, but this needs to be more investigated. But on the completion with primary completion, we just see the normal trend from pre-FP 1935 till the post-FP period. So this was not sharp. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Léonie. We'll give you a pause for breath now, and maybe we could take a question from the floor. Perhaps let Léonie not have a question for a moment. Okay, so 2 hands went. You've asked a question already. No? Are you sure?
She asked 2 questions.
I'll take one there. Someone from that side? No? Okay. At the back there and there. Okay, so I'm rubbish with names. Apologies if you know, I know you, but I can't remember your name. So please, first, could you say who you are?
Salman Assem with the World Bank. The first comment is just clarification from Justin. So when you're using the 50 years data, how has the measurement of literacy changed within the DHS instruments? And when you're controlling for the period effect, so is it just the quirkiness and the representativeness of the sample, or is it also the way that the measurement has changed for the literacy over the years? Second comment is for Ben.
I'm going to let you get away with this, but no one else, okay?
Thank you. Ben, the idea in terms of like going at scale is very good. I think we have reached this consensus after a very long time, and that's very encouraging. The key issue is in terms of like pivoting it to what is happening within the context. So if your PTRs are about 200, so the graph that one of the presenters showed in terms of the Vietnam and Ecuador comparison, I can make a similar graph with Malawi with 10 kilometers dispersion from the trading center, that the child that is born closer to the trading center is going to be 2 years ahead in terms of learning compared to the child that is 10 kilometers away. So in that kind of dispersion, once you start measuring average effects based on these interventions, so in 5 years' time, what will we say in terms of the success of these systems?
Great. Okay, quick questions if possible. Okay, at the back, could you say who you are?
Hi, I'm Mansi. I'm a student at UCL. And my question is to Michelle on the last comment about the systems that change are the ones that want to change. So we see for some countries there is like at the policy level, we see that change happening with the focus on FLN and so on. But maybe that's not happening in the implementation side. Whereas in other contexts like the Sierra Leone that we just saw, there's like ground level change. But what would you say is the dynamics of, and Vietnam is an exceptional example where both have happened, but what would you say the dynamics of bottoms up or top down change are?
Very short and just factual. In the 3 countries you mentioned, sorry, I'm Catherine Dom Mokoro and also ODI. In the 3 countries you mentioned, Justin, on the fact that the decline had started pre the decision of fee-free education. So one is Ethiopia, the other is Mali. I've forgotten the third one. Can you remind us the dates? And that's because I think that the sort of surrounding factors are matter as always.
Okay, thank you very much. Justin, do you want to take your 2 questions, one from Salman and one from Catherine? Then we'll go to Ben, and then we'll go finally to Michelle.
Yeah, I think mine are easy. So on Salman's question about measurement changes in the DHS, I mean, the nice thing about the DHS data for learning outcomes is that, they don't do a full learning assessment. They just measure literacy, but they don't do self-reported literacy. It is a actual test with a cue card with a sentence in the language of choice of the respondent, and it's whether or not the respondent can read that sentence, and it's scored 0, it's scored not at all, or sort of, or full literacy. That system has been in place and has been consistent across DHS waves. I guess I can't rule out the possibility that in practice, the implementation of that methodology has changed. I've asked people at DHS for hints about that and haven't gotten any, but if some of you may know, I welcome your, but in principle, it's the same measurement across survey rounds. So the third country, I think, was Madagascar that I put up there. I could have put others. And you're going to ask me to remember the FPE reform years for all three countries. For Ethiopia, it was 1994. And I don't know off the top of my head for Mali and Madagascar. And so what I was showing you was like the birth cohorts who were 10 years old. That was where the zero line was at the time of the reform. So by all means, other things were going on. The only thing we wanted to illustrate there is if you think, or as I showed, that taking away school fees did lead to a big influx of quote unquote marginal students. And if you think that that influx of marginal students is why we see quality going down, the composition changed, it seemed that that quality was deteriorating before that big compositional change.
Yeah, I think why I asked the question, because I believe maybe the expansion preceded to some extent the decision, the formal decision. And the second point is that the formal decision might not have translated into actual practice. And so, I mean, these are complicating factors. That's all the point I wanted to bring into the discussion.
To say one sentence, for sure, I agree with you, and I guess Lee's not here. We have a paper maybe coming out looking at all of the FPE announcements in sub-Saharan Africa that didn't never go anywhere, right? And so we tend to focus on papers that address the handful of FPE reforms that had impact. There were lots of others that were just, dead letter. I totally agree.
Great. Ben, on dispersion and average effects.
I don't think that was quite the question I was prepared to answer, but the one I heard you talk about was in particular around the issue of scale on the one hand, and then the Malawi class size issue on the other. So I want to be clear, when I'm talking about scale, it doesn't just mean have an idea that you write on paper, then nationalize the program. I think in a Malawi, like anywhere else, you need to figure out what are the sort of pedagogical methods and contexts that will work in extraordinarily large class sizes in a pilot, medium scale within government systems, and then think about scaling. Testing a program out in a small classroom and then saying, oh, it works there, let's roll out to 120 on average, just never gonna work. That said, when it comes to class size, now I want to move out of Malawi, because I do think the class sizes in Malawi are beyond where a normal teacher can really manage on average. But I've run a lot of regressions that looks at class size and learning outcomes. And the effect is not what you'd expect. If you don't account for location, often, at least in the data sets that I played around with, kids in larger classes have better outcomes. That's obviously because those kids are in urban schools. But even when you control for urbanicity and you're looking at rural schools, the relationship is very weak, if anything. So what does that mean? I have really shifted on this issue because I think fundamentally there are countries that have shown you can have effective instruction that works in large classes. 120, I think that's too large. What the kind of breakdown between large that can work and large that can't, I'm not sure, but it's less than 120. But I do think that there are things that are working with not just good teachers, but decent, mediocre teachers who are relatively unmotivated that can still work in large classes. That I think we need to think about designing those country specific, and then scaling them up after you've shown that it can work within the context. Thanks.
Let's do it.
Right.
Okay, Michelle, do you want to come to the points on dynamics and bottom up versus top down?
Absolutely, yeah, thanks. It's a great question. So I think on your points about kind of the or if I understood properly, the idea that there are policies set that sometimes don't happen, and then there are sometimes things that happen at the bottom that like filter up, so those dynamics. So, a couple thoughts. So one would be, what I am wanting to say, the point we're trying to make is that that the idea of like a commitment to the purpose of learning is a necessary condition, but it's not sufficient. Like, once it's in, you still have to have all those strong technical practices, right? And then you still have to have all the strong data and assessment systems and all the other things that come along with it. But if the commitment's not there, and you just start with the technical things and the support things, it's going to be really hard to get the sustained change on the learning front. So, I wouldn't ever say that it's a sufficient condition, but what we're trying to say is it's this kind of necessary condition that's not easy to measure, but that kind of needs to be in place if you want the other things that you're doing to be able to sustain and keep going. And so, the flip side too is that I do think, I've actually, someone has suggested that I should make what's currently a solid line in my technical core a dotted line to acknowledge that there's flow in both directions. And yes, I agree. I think in some areas there are. Like, I think the evidence on that is strongest in the case of teachers. Like, if you support teachers to just change their practices, then their buy-in to what you're doing can grow because they're able to have higher expectations of their students once they see their students are learning. So I do think there's a place where you can kind of improve the implementation, and that can lead to like setting higher expectations. But I think that that's more when we're talking about kind of maybe larger system shifts. It's harder that way at other levels of the system. And so I think, I don't know, for people that were here and heard Yamini talk about some of her work in Delhi, it's that changing the expectations of the mid-level bureaucrats that are pushing the paper and that their day job is to complete the paperwork by the end of the day. It's not fundamentally about learning. And so to change those expectations and say, now your job is fundamentally about how to improve learning. Some of the paperwork still has to happen, but on a deeper level, the expectations of your role has changed. That's the kind of shift that I'm talking about. And those are the levels at the system at which I think it is more important to change these set of expectations and norms.
Fantastic. We have some questions online, so if we could maybe take one brief one. We've got about 4 minutes left.
Great. Yeah, the top question online is also from Michelle. How much does Vietnam's socialist past and political ideology today around building a new man through education affect the country's purpose?
Yeah, if you could answer that in a minute, that'd be great.
I guess it connects to that question of like where does purpose changing the purpose come from, right?
Defer to Jonathan.
Well, I can talk about the new socialist man, but that was a concept from the 60s. But I think what I would simply emphasize to this general discussion is I know where you're going, I think, with your argument, but I wouldn't say that, the systems want to change. Actors, people want to change. And I think one of the things that we observe in all the instances that you point out, and it comes up in other research too, is that there's multiple and sort of multi-directional commitment to education across the system. I'm very interested in listening to these discussions about what it means to sort of enthuse a system. And what does education as a vocation mean? Because one of the things I've learned through this process is that a lot of the technical stuff, you can go on and on and on, but it doesn't tell us much about what's happening in the classroom. And so what are the mechanisms, going back to an earlier discussion, what are the conditions under which, as Kane might put it, do we have this enthusiasm and activation of all of these necessary parts of an education system? Education is a political practice all the way through, and it has to be recognized at all of these different levels, including in the classroom.
Michelle, do you want to say any more?
I mean, that was an excellent answer. But I can try, but we probably would get more out of asking another question.
Just before we thank our speakers, I'd just like to say, I thought the papers, they were diverse, but in many ways, the session has encompassed some of the key messages that's been emerging from the body of RISE work. So from Justin, he posed the question, the learning crisis, is it new? It's not new, it turns out, from the very careful data work, but it's real. The stagnation or decline was very marked in what he showed us. And coming out from aspects of Léonie's work and from Ben's research and interviews, foundational literacy and numeracy is key to this. We saw that in terms of the primary schooling and having long-term impacts by demand-side transmission, and the fact that many of the respondents echoed that for Ben. But change is possible. as Michelle's case studies show, but a commitment and a purpose around learning is going to be key. And that seems to be, these are the messages that are coming out from the wider RISE body of research. So I thank our speakers for doing that, and yeah, we will go on to our next session.
Okay.
15 minutes. Okay?
Sure.
You can go use the facilities and bring this team. We're going to start again at 4:15.